Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for the next speaker in our speaker series. My name is Katie Johnson, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Heritage Trust. And I'd just like to welcome you all and thank you for taking the time to spend your evening here with us. This is our 2022 speaker series. We're about halfway through of the stories we tell about nature and the stories nature tells about us. We're so excited to have another great speaker here tonight in Dr. Kaeli Swift. But first, I have some exciting Heritage Trust news and announcement. As a lot of you know, our wonderful previous director, Rebecca Remetmer, has retired this year after over 20 years of great service for the Trust. And we are so excited to announce the hiring of a new director. Susan Hutton will be joining us, starting as the new executive director here in May. And we're so excited that she will be leading the charge for the Heritage Trust. She comes with a wealth of knowledge and experience and has been visiting the island for over 25 years. She's been here a permanent resident for the last few years and is really looking forward to joining in with this community and leading the charge. So I hope throughout the summer and as this goes on, you will take the chance to get to welcome Susan and invite her into the Heritage Trust. And it's a really exciting time for us. And with that, I would like to pass it off to one of our board members, Don Dietrich, to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, I'll just start by saying I wish I could see all of your faces. It would be so lovely to connect with you that way as well. But it's very special that we can share in this way and bring this exciting speaker to you. Before we begin, though, I would like to acknowledge that the land that we are on today are the ancestral and current homelands of the Laktamish, the Lummi people, who are the original inhabitants of Washington's northernmost coast, the San Juan Islands, and southern British Columbia. Being the original fishers, hunters, gatherers, and harvesters of this region, they have worked, struggled, and celebrated on the shores and waters of the Salish Sea, and they continue their traditional ways of life and land management practices today. The Lummi Nation currently leads the fight against ongoing environmental crises, such as fossil fuel dependency, coal transportation, green crab infestations, decreasing salmon runs, and the declining health of the Nooksack River. The Lummi Island Heritage Trust extends our respect and our gratitude for the environmental leadership of the Laktamish people and their enduring care and gratitude their enduring care and protection of these shared lands and waterways. We commit to doing our own work to understand and acknowledge historical injustices and to work productively and collaboratively with our Indigenous neighbors. Tonight, we continue our speaker series with our third guest, Dr. Kaeli Swift. Dr. Swift is a visiting lecturer at the University of Washington, where she teaches a variety of ornithology and wildlife ecology courses. The Heritage Trust first heard about her because of her highly praised talk on Corvid Mythologies, which was presented at the North Cascades Institute, and where she fused a scientific study of corvids with the types of global mythologies associated with them. We realized that she would be a perfect speaker for this series on the stories we tell about nature, the stories nature tells about us. Dr. Swift has fused a lifelong interest in science communication and citizen science with studies in animal and human cognition, as well as the implications of this research for conservation. Specifically, her work has focused on corvid research, as mentioned, using brain activity to study the underlying processing in the American crow. For example, how American crows respond to dead crows, and then analyzing what adaptive motivations might drive their response. This type of inquiry requires both field-based projects observing wild crows and non-invasive, non-lethal functional imaging studies aimed at understanding what is going on in the crow brain during these experiences. Dr. Swift's current research project involves field work aimed at studying a much less familiar and understood bird, the Tinian monarch. Tinian monarchs are a small songbird in the monarch flycatcher family, native to only one island in the entire world, Tinian, of the Northern Mariana Islands. And this is where Dr. Swift joins us from tonight, although she told us it's tomorrow at 11:30 in the morning, her time. Since 2021, she and Dr. Beth Gardner, a quantitative ecologist, have been doing field work in Tinian, focusing on the reproductive success of the Tinian monarch, which has survived centuries of colonization, military operations, and severe deforestation on the island. The research team is hoping to fill in questions regarding Tinian songbirds' natural history, such as site fidelity and dispersal patterns. Dr. Swift's research has been published in National Geographic, the New York Times, and the Atlantic, and has been featured on PBS, Ologies podcast, and other media sites. She has also contributed to a work of fiction entitled The Other Animals, a collection of short stories written by scientists, fiction writers, and comics, and informed by behavioral science. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaeli Swift.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Wow, that was an amazing intro. I should have you write the bio for my website. That was terrific. I am so excited to join you all to talk about something that is, as mentioned, not exactly my area of expertise, but the thing that I have learned as a primarily as a scientist of corvids is that once you start to learn about these birds, once you really engage with them in any capacity, what becomes so clear is their connection to us. And so while I can't claim to be an anthropologist, I hope that my personal studies of crows and ravens and the ways that they have connected to us across the world, I can share a little bit of that with you here today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me just one moment. Oh, this one. Okay, how does that look? You see a nice little cover title? Perfect. All right. So like I said, we have gathered here today to talk about Corvid symbolism and mythology, both across the world and through time. But before we get there, I'm going to give you a little science background because it's very helpful in contextualizing some of the things that we're going to talk about. So first and foremost, crows and ravens. What's the deal? Are they different? Are they the same bird? Are they not? Certainly historically, there's been a lot of ambiguity, and part of that comes from people not necessarily being super specific as they described these animals in legends and in stories, but also because across the world, some languages don't even differentiate between different birds. But from a taxonomic scientific perspective, a crow and a raven, specifically with a North American perspective, American crow and a common raven are different species. There's about 45 different species of crows and ravens around the world. You can find representatives of these birds basically anywhere you go, with the exception of the South Americas, the Central and South America, and Antarctica. But any other continent you visit, you will find many different species of these birds. When it comes to identifying the ones that you all are most likely to see in your backyards, some of my best tips are that ravens are quite a bit bigger than crows, and you get a little of that from the specimens picture I have here on this slide. They're about 2.5 times the size of a crow. It's not insignificant. And if you're used to seeing crows and you finally encounter a raven, even if you don't consider yourself a keen birder, you will most likely be able to detect the difference. It's kind of like spending your life around min pins and then seeing an actual full-size pinscher. You're just like, whoa, that's a much bigger dog. The colors and the shape and all of that is the same, but woof, that's a big critter. Ravens are more what we would describe as a wildland species. So you find them much, much further away from human settlements. And as a result, they're more of what we call a carrion specialist. So ravens are eating a lot more dead animals than crows are. Crows, on the other hand, much higher portion of their diet is garbage, and they're generally found much closer to human settlements. In terms of their physical appearance, like I said, size is a big one, but the other things that you can look at to distinguish between these two birds are the throats. So crows have much smoother throats. Ravens, on the other hand, have these specialized elongated throat feathers called hackles, and they can articulate them in all kinds of visual displays. And then in flight, the easiest way to tell them apart is to look at the tail shape. So crows have a much more rounded or kind of squared tail, depending on how much they're fanning those feathers out, while ravens will always have that characteristic wedge shape. So if you see them in flight, that's the easiest way to tell. If you want a little more practice learning the differences between these birds, or if you ever just want to ask me, you can find me on social media. And every Wednesday, I play a little game called Crow or No, where I post a picture and you have to decide if the bird featured in the photo has the word crow in its common name or not. So feel free to check that out if you ever want a little more practice. So in thinking about these birds and why humans, everywhere that we find them interacting, have made such deep connections to them, there's a few key features of their natural history that I think really inform that relationship. So the first one is that these birds can be incredibly long-lived. It's not atypical for an adult crow in Seattle to live to be around 14 years of age. Ravens can, particularly in captivity, can live to be even longer. But the idea is these are not wild animals with an especially high turnover rate. And the other sort of key complement to that is that they're often territorial. And so together, what that means is if you go out and you're engaging with a crow or a raven over time, you can really build a very long-term relationship over a decade or more potentially. And so that really comes with it a sense of intimacy that's not necessarily available with a lot of other kinds of birds or other wildlife. The other key features of these birds is that they have a more generalist diet. Even ravens, even though they're eating a lot more carrion than crows are, they're still generalists. And they're very keen to steal food from the bigger predators. In fact, this is one of my favorite things to tell people about ravens. So there's, and this is a mythology lecture. I just put this together. It's perfect little Mythbuster opportunity. So I am guessing many of you have heard this idea that ravens and wolves are this symbiotic species where ravens will croak to tell wolves where a carcass is, and then the wolves come and they rip the carcass open and they all have, this big buffet together. And people love to tell that story, and it's not true. It's not true. So they've done a lot of studies in different parts of North America trying to validate it, because there's clearly a very strong association between the two. The idea that there is symbiosis is not necessarily wrong. It's that partnership is positive and is welcomed by both parties. That's the part that people get wrong. So what we actually see is true between wolves and ravens is that while ravens are very, very keen to hone in on wolf kills so that they can come and steal food, wolves would much rather they weren't around, because ravens can steal an incredibly high proportion of a kill. And this has had a major consequence in wolf dynamics, because we've noticed that wolves tend to hunt and feed in higher pack sizes than is actually the most efficient. They're a little too big. So there's been this question of why do they hunt in these kind of clunky, big packs? And the answer seems to be that you need a certain threshold of wolves in order to protect a carcass from the onslaught of ravens that will come and steal the meat. And so this relationship is incredibly strong and incredibly important. It's just not the kind of positive sharing of food that's so often purported in Facebook memes and kind of word of mouth. But this would have mattered a lot for early hominids, because in early humans, because as we took down big predators, we absolutely would have had crows and ravens coming in and trying to get food from us. So that's kind of that first step in that really close association and that engagement, seeing those animals a lot. And then kind of moving forward through time, now with a species like an American crow or a house crow, the term we would use for that relationship is a synanthrope. And what that means is an animal that doesn't just adapt to people, you know, like your chickadees or your robins, where they can do pretty well in suburbia. Chickadees are happy to come to your feeder, but they can kind of take you or leave you. While an American crow or a house crow, they really rely on human development. We create spaces that are actually ideal for them. And so we've sort of seen this cultural transition from animals that would have associated with us because of the benefits we offered in terms of foraging opportunities to a tight-knit, inextricable relationship between some of these species. So with that in mind, the reason why crows would have so closely associated with us becomes a little bit more clear, and we can kind of see that biological basis for that relationship. So before I move on, I want to have everyone just take a quick moment to think. So when I say, what do crows and ravens symbolize? What do they represent to you? If you think about what you see that in a movie or in a book, what is it intended to describe? What do you think? And feel free, if you want to drop your perspective in the comments, feel free to do that. But I just want everyone to kind of think, first word that comes to mind, crow and raven, popular media. What is that? What is the messaging there typically? I'll give you just a minute to think about that. Yeah, so I'm seeing, I don't know if you can see me looking at the comments. I'm definitely seeing a lot of like death, foreboding. And from my perspective, that is, oops, why are you doing this? That is absolutely right. From, you know, Disney movies to Hitchcock's The Birds to just Googling, you know, crow and raven artwork, you get a lot of this kind of imagery, right? This very strong relationship to death or foreboding. And so what I want to unpack in the course of this talk is, why does that association exist? Is that a valid representation of how humans across time in the world have actually viewed these animals? And is that relationship changing at all? Was it always this way, basically? So to start, we're going to go way back. So crows and ravens and corvids of all kinds appear, as I've sort of been hinting at, appear in most human cultures where the two coexist. For example, they're mentioned 10 times in the Old Testament. They represent a variety of things, from wisdom to longevity to prophecy, but the most kind of interesting thing to pull out of this is that they're mentioned really frequently and with a lot of similarity. Such that we kind of think that there might have been this quote unquote cult of crow. So there's so many similarities in the stories told about crows, particularly when we look at stories across the Arctic Circle, that it's possible that there was some kind of archaic cult of crow that once existed, originating in Central Asia and then spreading across Inuit cultures to the east and Celtic and Nordic cultures to the west. So we see a lot of similarities in how people sort of first started to think about these animals. The computer is giving me a really hard time advancing my slides and now appears to be frozen. Why is this happening? Can you see it advancing on your end? Does it still say Corvids and humans?
It still says Corvids and humans.
There we go. Okay.
It just advanced.
There we go. All right. So let's go all the way back to ancient Mediterranean. So in Egypt, Greece, and Rome, corvids were actually not used as symbols of death and foreboding, but were actually commonly used as symbols in love and marriage. In fact, Ares and Aphrodite were often depicted as two crows. And seeing two crows in a marriage was a very auspicious sign, but you did not want to just see one crow because that meant that your wedding was doomed. The crow song, which you can see on the slide, kind sirs, give a handful of wheat to the crow, the child of Apollo, or a platter of wheat, or a loaf or a penny, or what you will, was often sang at Athenian weddings to bless the couple. So far from the symbol of death and foreboding, these animals were symbols of love. So in contemporary, when we look at sort of contemporary depictions of Greek art, we often see that Hera we'll see that Hera is most closely associated with the peacock, and that did eventually become true, but it was originally crows and not peacocks that were sacred to Hera, who is the goddess of marriage. Let's see, there really should be a crow there, and not a peacock. So again, we see this theme of crows as representations of love in Greco culture. One of the pieces of evidence of this, that it was originally corvids and not peacocks, is in the Voyage of Argo, which was written by Apollonius Rhodes in the 3rd century BC. We have Jason the hero. This might be a familiar story to those of you who have learned about Greek mythology. He had the seemingly impossible task of collecting the golden fleece from the dragon. To succeed, Hera, along with Athena and Aphrodite, made a powerful sorceress, Medea, fall in love with him. To communicate the plans between all of the different parties, it's told that Hera used the crow and not the peacock to do that. And without that strong connection to the crow, it wouldn't have really made sense in these old stories for her to have used that animal and not the peacock. So you can see that while these birds sort of changed a little bit with time, they did originally have that really specific meaning in Greek culture. So eventually, like I said, the peacock did replace the crow in Hera's favor. In a fable by Roman Phaedrus, a jackdaw picked up some feathers of the peacock to adorn himself. He then scorned his own flock for being less beautiful. He tried to join a flock of peacocks, thinking that he would fit right in now, but they attacked him and stripped away his feathers. He tried to rejoin the jackdaws, but they would no longer accept him. Many versions of this fable are told as a moral tale of the dangers of trying to aspire above one's station in life. Just maybe not the best message nowadays, but is another nice example of the way that early peoples use these birds as a way to explain the world and impart wisdom and messages. Ooh. But before we start getting a little too ahead of ourselves, even in ancient Mediterranean times, it wasn't all love. So in other ways, Greco-Roman cultures were pretty ambivalent about crows. They weren't always on the best terms with the gods because they often stole meat from our altars, which there's no arguing with that. That definitely happened. And so instead, we also see them used as a symbol for Apollo. And in fact, Charon, the Greek root for all the corvids, comes from Coronis, which was Apollo's mistress. And this is really important because this gets at one of my favorite myths, which is, why is the crow black? So there are many versions of this story, as we will see, that have been told across the world, but this is the Greek version. So in the one told by Apollodorus, Coronis made love to Apollo, but in the end ended up marrying somebody else. The crow, which was then white, brought the news of the marriage to Apollo. This completely outraged him, and in a fit of anger, Apollo burned the crow, and later Coronis, for bringing the bad news. And so we'll see that one of my favorite aspects of human beings, really, as an animal, is our desire to tell stories, and to tell stories as a way of explaining why the world is. And we have had a very strong inclination to want to explain why the crow is black, probably because in most parts of the world where we find them, they are just black. There are some instances, there are white-necked ravens in Africa, for example. Certainly the magpies and jays of the world are much more colorful, but basically anywhere else you find crows and ravens, they're black. And people are so curious to understand why that would be. And so you can see a variety of these different stories that try and get at that. Moving on to the ancient, staying in the ancient Mediterranean, some of the other symbolism of these birds was wealth, long life, and eternal hope. So again, just kind of underscoring this idea that it wasn't always this way, that they had this close connection to death and foreboding. Moving on to the Middle Ages, so probably the best known symbolism and use of these birds in this era is from the Norse god and in Nordic traditions. But of course, the Norse god Odin and his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, which represent thought and mind. They originate probably much earlier, but they're first attested to in the 13th century in the Poetic Edda. And basically these birds, their task was to fly around and bring Odin information. And we see descriptions of these birds and his fears about them getting lost and the ways that they informed his decision-making in a lot of different fables from this time. And the origin of these birds is linked to the Norse concept of Philja. So Philja is a supernatural being that accompanies a person throughout life. It's often tied to specific bloodlines, whereas a family, you might have one specific Philja that goes with you and all of your children. The direct translation of the word can also mean afterbirth, and the origin of that is probably that Philja are connected to their person at the start of life. The thinking is that they're actually in the womb with the child. Animals that therefore eat after birth, so things like mice or carrion feeders like crows and ravens, foxes, cats, dogs, were therefore common in some sagas as representations of different Philja. However, the one sort of tricky thing, and I would love to speak with somebody more whose specialty is more in these middle-aged Nordic storytelling traditions, is that seeing a Philja in person was often an omen of death. So it's interesting that Odin interacted with them in person. Normally, if you saw them, it was while you were in a dream state. But if you saw them in person, then that was no good. So clearly the Hugin and Munin were a slightly different take off of this, the Philja tradition, similar, where these birds were sort of extension of Odin's own interests and his actions. Unfortunately, though, while the Nordic tradition has featured crows and ravens really heavily and often in really beautiful ways, we're sadly seeing a reappropriation of traditional Nordic symbols for really nefarious purposes. Viking symbols are increasingly being reappropriated by white supremacists, driven by this belief in a golden age of Nordic racial purity. So you can see symbols of the raven. We saw this at the storming of the Capitol, people dress in that kind of Nordic garb, and that's all part of this trend that we are unfortunately seeing. And that precedent was really set originally by the Nazis, who really idealized Norse people as sort of the perfect person. So while, especially if you have that Nordic heritage, it's so important to tap into that and reclaim those symbols. I just want to sort of offer that as a word of warning or a little heads up to folks that proceed a little bit with caution when you're seeing some of the symbology, because it might not be coming from a place of Corvid appreciation or Nordic heritage. It might be coming from somewhere else. We find that in the Middle Ages, crows and ravens, we see this shift where they are much more often used in depictions of war and battle than they were in ancient times. So for example, Morrigan and Babda are often depicted as crows, and those are the Celtic goddesses of battle. Celtic sacrifices have been found dating back to the Iron Ages, where we have pits of dead ravens, often arranged with their wings spread, and having been found in England and Ireland. So we would see these sacrificial pits of dead corvids as a way to hopefully look fondly upon an outlook of a battle. And so with this violence, particularly the violence that was kind of coming along as humans across Europe were waging these really violent wars, that's really when we start to see this really strong connection, this stronger link, I should say, between Corvids and death kind of first starting to appear. So as humans continued violent wars across Europe, corvids had the opportunities to eat the remains of human bodies. So this from the Avarium of the 12th century, the raven is understood as sometimes a preacher, sometimes as a sinner, and sometimes as the devil. So if you're wondering where that association with death comes from, it's really starting about here in the Middle Ages. And we see that really frequently depicted in the art of that time. So you can see, skeletons and dead bodies, and along with them are scavengers, things like crows, sometimes vultures, but often with a very strong emphasis on crows and other corvids. The other sort of historically important thing that was happening at that time that was forging this connection between corvids and death was the plague. So peaking between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed at least 75 million people across Europe and Asia. And during that time, there was like such an overwhelming amount of dead bodies. People had no idea what to do. So they were everywhere outside, which was great for the corvids and for the other carrion feeders of that time, because they had so much opportunity to feast upon these dead bodies. In addition to just that visual of seeing, your loved ones who had died of this horrific disease out and being feasted on, plague doctors would wear these really iconic masks. And the reason for that was that the smell was so overpowering that they needed a way to sort of infiltrate their nose with something more pleasant. And so they had these sort of beak-like projections that they could stuff with aromatics so that they could tolerate the smell. But again, that just sort of forged in this Western culture, this connection between crows and ravens and death. So this resulted in corvids being incorporated into European superstitions that make corvids avatars of death. But interestingly, that wasn't necessarily bad. Just because they had this connection to death, that wasn't necessarily looked at as a bad thing, because while they were associated with this foreboding, they weren't the cause of it. And so that was actually really useful, right? Because if you're laying in bed sick and you see a raven come perch outside your window, rather than being mad because it's telling you that you're about to die, you're like, all right, okay, I gotta make good with God. I gotta get my affairs in order, do all that stuff. So it was really looked at as a positive thing because it helped people prepare for death. So even though they had this strong connection there, we still hadn't quite made that full tip to where it's this really negative relationship. Moving on to Asia, like many indigenous North Americans, the indigenous peoples of Siberia attributed creation to ravens. And so returning back to that idea I presented at the beginning of this sort of cult of crow and the similarity of storytelling across continents, this idea of crows and ravens as creators is one of those really common themes that we see. So for example, the Chukchi of northeastern Siberia tell that once there was only Raven and his wife. Eventually, though, they got bored. So Raven's wife asked him to create the world, but he didn't know how to. So she went to sleep and gave birth to the first humans. And Raven was so inspired by her act that he created the world to fill in the rest of it. By contrast, the Kukluk Inuits tell that ravens created their land by diving into water and bringing up the sand from the seabed. The petals in the sand became humans who Raven later taught to hunt and fish. So we can see these similarities in people using these birds as a way to explain how the world came into being. But beyond just kind of those creation stories, we also see that their direct symbolism is also a little bit different than what we saw in ancient Mediterranean and in the Middle Ages. So for example, in Japan, crows are often used as avatars of fate. And a really good illustration of this is in the story of Jimmy Tenno, who was the first emperor of Japan, was wandering in search of a place to found his kingdom when he spots a crow sent by Amaterasu, the sun goddess. He followed the crow to Yamato, where he settled and became ancestor to all Japanese emperors. The image that you see here is of the three-legged crow, and the three-legged crow is featured in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean folklore, where it has different names, which you can see here on the slide. I would try and say them, but I won't be able to as a non-native speaker. But if anybody else knows how to pronounce these words correctly, please chime in at the end of the talk. But we see this strong similarity across those areas of this three-legged crow and its use in symbolism and other creation stories. So for example, the most famous one is probably this one, which is depicted in this mural from the Han Dynasty. The story goes that there was originally 10 sun crows, which settled in 10 separate suns. These were the children of the Lord of Heaven and the Goddess of Sun. They all perched in a celestial mulberry tree called Pusang and took turns ascending into the sky. One day the suns rebelled against heaven and all 10 appeared in the sky at once, drying up the oceans and threatening to burn up all the crops. The Confucian Emperor Yao prayed to the Lord of Heaven for help, and he sent an archer, Yi, to frighten the suns into returning to their tree. Yi, however, decided that he had no choice but to shoot the suns. He could not frighten them, so he had to kill them. With each shot, a great ball of fire would appear in the sky and a three-legged raven would fall to the ground. Yao feared that Yi would shoot all of the suns from the sky, so he stole the arrow before the last shot, leaving the one sun remaining in the sky. In India, it's not the crow, it's the crow and not the owl that is a symbol of wisdom. So we see that symbology changing a little bit. I really like this story because, so particularly I think for those of us in the Pacific Northwest, if you have barred owls, which I'm guessing a lot of you probably have close to where you live, you are probably familiar with the contention between the corvids and the owls. We would see it a lot on campus, for example. I would see it from my home in Seattle. And so in India, there's a storytelling tradition of, well, why do crows and owls fight so much? Why are these two species often going after one another? And the story tries to explain this contention. So the story goes that once birds assembled to elect a king and choose an owl and they chose an owl because of his regal appearance. The owl, being nocturnal, was asleep while they prepared his coronation to formally anoint him as king. Once the crow arrived, it laughed at the choice, saying that the owl was in fact too ugly to be king, and the birds already had a king, Garuda, which was the eagle-headed mount of Vishnu. The birds agreed that this was correct and decided to fly away, foregoing the owl's coronation and his crowning as king. Once the owl woke up, however, and realized that the crow had convinced all of the other birds to abandon him, he vowed to feud with crows from then on. So you can see this is an image that depicts, these are hooded crows. Hooded crows have this kind of gray vest. That's why they look a little less familiar than our American crows. And they have trapped a bunch of owls in a cave and are burning them alive, which in the tradition of ancient storytelling is as grisly as it often is. Moving forward to Indigenous Americans. So I really like this piece by Elizabeth Rideau. This was featured for a long time at King Street Station. And I'm going to take you through each panel, but it shows her strong connection to corvids. So you can see she's sitting on a city bus. She sees a raven. And she follows it back to her homeland. So for those of us living in the Pacific Northwest, you're probably familiar with this idea that peoples of that area had a particularly strong connection with crows and ravens, and we see that really frequently in their storytelling. So just like we saw in the Siberian storytelling tradition, the Haida people of the Pacific Northwest also used ravens as their greater creator. So in fact, Greater Raven is the creator that first called the world into being. This sculpture by Bill Reed depicts the most common story of that tradition. Greater Raven began to make humans out of both leaf and rock, but never finished the humans made of rock, which was really bad news for us because while rocks are pretty eternal, leaves fade and decompose really quick. So that means that humans, having been made out of leaf, are doomed to death. Dang it. This is how death came into the world. The reason that I really like that story in particular is because it has a really funny sort of connection, totally coincidentally, to a story by the Romans and Europeans in the mid-century. So Greater Raven's procrastination with the people of rock is sort of a fairly funny coincidence with how the Romans depicted crows. So their name for them at the time was cross, and that was named after the call that they made, which means tomorrow. So in some cases, this is a reminder of mortality, but in other cases, it's a symbol of procrastination. So this illustration by Albrecht Dürer from 1400, you can see that a fool is being charmed by the ravens croaking to procrastinate his tasks till tomorrow. So we're not the only people to recognize that sometimes ravens take up a task and then sort of get a little bored and forget about it, sometimes with very important consequences like the longevity of the human life. But it's really important to recognize that while some indigenous cultures did have this more sort of reverence-based appreciation or storytelling tradition of crows and ravens, that's not true across all indigenous communities across North America. So for example, in the Southwest, the Hopis regarded Crow Mother as the maternal ancestor to the spirit world, but more generally, they regarded crows and ravens as thieves and tricksters rather than as guides or masters of the universe. So earlier, I told the story of why the Greeks thought the crow was black. And in that case, as you may recall, it's because a crow had to deliver bad news. And so he was burned in retaliation for being the messenger. But there's another story that might be more familiar to some of you that I want to tell. That's a different version of, or a different explainer of why these birds are black. So this story is often misattributed to the Lenape because it was published in 1989 on the basis of telling by the principal chief of the Eastern Lenape Nations, Bill Thompson. And there was a Reading Rainbow children's book that was made based on this story. However, and I have even made the mistake of attributing this story to the Lenape people in the past myself. However, Lenape scholars have rejected that this is a traditional Lenape story. And in fact, they've rejected any association with crows as important as playing any significant role in their storytelling traditions, which is a good reminder not only of our need to be really careful as we cite sources, but also that this whole talk is sort of premised on the basis that crows have a really strong connection to human beings. And while that's largely true, it is still important to recognize exceptions and not treat people who are maybe geographically similar as monoliths that therefore have really similar storytelling traditions. Instead, we now understand this legend, which is called the Rainbow Crow or the Fire Crow, as probably a Cherokee storytelling tradition. But the story as it goes is that at one time, the crow was a beautiful technicolored bird, full of all of the colors of the earth and with a beautiful singing voice. During a prolonged period of cold and darkness, however, the animals came together desperate for warmth and decided somebody needed to go up into the sky to communicate with the great sky spirit that they needed warmth on earth. Rainbow Crow, being so generous, offered to make the arduous journey himself. So off he goes well into the sky to contact the great sky spirit. He's successful. He manages to get there. And so as a reward for the arduous journey, she bequeaths him a burning stick, which he has to fly back down to earth. Unfortunately, though, during the flight back, the burning stick has rendered his feathers black and his throat hoarse. The crow clearly feels very bad that this has happened. He's lost his beautiful feathers, he's lost his beautiful singing voice and is complaining. And the great sky spirit comes down to earth to tell him that while he did make this incredible sacrifice, his black feathers and his hoarse throat will protect him from the greed of man, who will not covet him for his feathers, who will not covet him for his voice. But still, if you look closely, which hopefully you can see a little bit in this picture of the raven, you can see that their feathers are fairly iridescent. So they reflect a variety of colors. And so even though the crow and raven has been rendered black by his sacrifice, if you look closely, you can still see that legacy of those beautiful technicolor feathers. And this was enough to satisfy Crow. So this story is clearly not only an effort to explain something about the world, but is also a way to communicate the importance of selflessness and self-sacrifice. If you're interested in learning more about this story, there was a really terrific short film that came out a few years ago starring John Legend and Oprah Winfrey that was produced by Indigenous filmmakers that depict this story. It's like 18 minutes, so if you have kids or just really like this kind of thing, it might be worth checking out. I'm pretty sure that you can watch it for free online. So as we start to wrap up, I want to address one other sort of important aspect of crows and ravens as symbols. So earlier we talked about the appropriation of symbols, of the appropriation of Nordic raven symbols for sinister purposes, but there's a much more common way that a lot more people have a tendency to appropriate these symbols in ways that can cause harm. So I just want to take a few minutes to address that. So something that I see as somebody who interacts with a lot of people who feel an incredibly strong connection to these birds and really want ways to express that is that we sometimes over appropriate, particularly native indigenous artworks and religious traditions as a way to try and explain our connections to these birds. And the problem with that is those kinds of behaviors are not only vocally rejected by members of indigenous communities, but they do truly contribute to harm by erasing indigenous cultures. There's three really simple things that we can do to not only better express our passion for these birds and the deep connections that we have with them, while not perpetuating those kinds of harm. So the first one is to choose alternatives to terms like spirit animals, which, while not unique to religious traditions, excuse me, which while not unique to North American indigenous religious traditions, in principle, right, we talked about the Nordic tradition of some kind of guide through life. That language is largely used to reflect Native American practices. And we've seen all over ways that that religious tradition has really been devalued. And probably wine is my spirit animals. There's no better way to depict that. And there's so much of that kind of stuff. And sometimes when I express to people why it is important to choose other language, folks kind of push back because they think that means what's being asked of them is to reject the natural world and to reject a spiritual connection to the natural world. But that's not what it is. And it's really important to recognize that difference. Instead, what's being asked is to ground your spiritual connection in ways that are authentic to your identity and your cultural heritage and your religious background. And I could try and summarize this in a really compelling way, but instead what I'm going to do is play for you a very short audio clip from Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, whose name might be familiar to you if you've read Braiding Sweetgrass or Gathering Moss. She's an astounding natural history writer, and I heard an interview with her on the Ologies podcast where I think that she just kind of explains how to do this in a way that's much more compelling. So I'm just going to let her speak for herself here.
I think it's also really important to, when we're avoiding cultural appropriation, to have an authentic experience of engagement with place. You don't need to say, well, Native people tell us to be grateful for the gifts of plants around us. Yes, that's absolutely true. But the way that you manifest that gratitude should be in your own cultural framework. You don't have to take another way of showing gratitude for the gifts of the earth. You can show it your own way. And so coming up with authentic expressions of your own relationship with the living world is a way to make your experiences much more powerful because they're your own, and it avoids cultural appropriation as well.
And particularly after this talk, I hope that the access to doing that is much more clear if it wasn't before, because again, crows and ravens have a very strong cultural history pretty much wherever you go in the world. And so barring folks with Central or South American cultural heritage, you can find ways to incorporate these birds that are much more reflective of that specific heritage. Number two, I kind of touched on this earlier, is just recognize the diversity of Indigenous nations and cite specific sources. It's not that we're not, and I've struggled with this a little bit as somebody giving this talk, right? I'm talking about a lot of different concepts and histories that are not my own. And the guiding principle that I've used to do that is the same one that I use in science: cite your sources, right? So recognize that, a meme like this, which I see so often on Facebook, the Native Americans believe yada, yada, yada. No, Native Americans comprise a vast diversity of nations. So if you are going to share a creation story as a way to discuss these birds or show appreciation, just make sure that you're taking the time to really figure out who that story comes from, so that you can recognize that individual heritage and you can recognize that different identity. And then the last one is making sure that if you're buying anything related to traditional artwork or storytelling about these birds, that you're buying directly from Indigenous sellers. And this is actually a really big one. It's really hard for me sometimes to put these talks together, because when I'm trying to Google images, like when I talked about the story of the rainbow crow, I used a photograph of a raven that I had taken. Ideally, I wanted to use an illustration, but I literally couldn't find one that I could vet as having come from an Indigenous artist, because there's just so much on the internet that comes from all kinds of people. And that matters, particularly financially and economically, because it really takes away from possible revenue streams to these Indigenous artists. So for example, the Alaska Department of Commerce and Development estimates that anywhere from 75 to 80% of what's branded as Native art, and having done fieldwork in Alaska, that stuff is everywhere, I can tell you, was not actually made by Alaska Natives. And that's millions of dollars in revenue that's being taken away from those communities. So as you shop, make sure to shop from inspired natives and not things that are Native inspired. For any parents out there that are interested in sharing some of these mythology stories that we've talked about with their kids, I strongly encourage you to check out the Sea Alaska Heritage, which has an entire book collection featuring mostly the Tlingit and Tsimshian storytelling traditions of these birds. They have all of the really familiar tales and a lot that you probably haven't heard from. They're really beautiful, beautifully illustrated books. So if you're interested in sharing this with your kids, this is a really great place to go for that. So finally, to summarize, main take-home message is, we started this talk by asking ourselves, is this symbology of crows as they're currently depicted in Western contemporary culture of being omens of death, is that really how it's always been, or how it's been across the world? And the answer is no. Corvids as a tool of symbolism have been used to depict love, the sun, divine creators, tricksters, death, war, wisdom, mortality, procrastination, and fate. These are clearly incredibly important birds to us as people. And we will, I'm sure, as time goes on, be able to add even more uses and symbolism for these birds. In fact, a quick Google search of crow meme returns over 17 million results. So, the internet is what it is, but this is how we are using these birds to communicate our emotions, our storytelling now in contemporary culture. And it will soon be just as valid as any of these other stories. And I just think it's so wonderful that no matter where you are in time or space, you really can't escape the significance that these birds have in our lives. So with that, I am happy to open the floor to any questions that you have. Feel free to hit me with those biology questions. If crow did something weird in your yard, I'm happy to answer that too. But thank you so much for joining me. And I appreciate everyone taking the time.
Wow, thank you so much. That was amazing. That was absolutely amazing. So interesting, all these vital traditions and differences and connections, and thank you so much. And I think that we're ready to take some questions from folks. So feel free to pop those in the chat window. And I don't know, are people able to ask orally too, Katie, or is it just chat window?
I think just chat window
Okay,
for now. If I can figure
okay.
out how to do it, I will. But if you have questions, feel free to type those in and we'll get them answered here in just a minute.
I see a comment by Kelly. Having an authentic relationship with nature is an important aspect of what you shared, and we should not limit our appreciation or artistic expression of the natural world. Rebecca asks a question, why is a group of crows called a murder of crows?
Great question. So murder of crows, conspiracy of ravens, flamboyance of flamingos are all colloquialisms that have no like scientific basis. So I, for example, would never refer to a murder of crows in a paper. They are made up names. I don't exactly know the like origin of them, but somebody just said that at one point and it stuck. And yeah, I mean, certainly we can imagine based on the trend we saw of these birds through time, that was sort of a post-Middle Ages, post-plague, where we had that sort of negative, or death, I should say, the sort of stronger association with death fully come into form. But there's not really a reason. It's just somebody made that up.
I see that Nicole asked if this recording will be available to view later. It will. I think, Katie, do you usually send it to all of the participants, and then it will be posted on the website, the Lummi Island Heritage Trust website as well?
Yeah, yep, we'll do that, and then also put it on our YouTube page, and definitely make sure you guys all have access to a copy of it.
And I think we have a prospective student, Dr. Swift. Nick Jacobs asks, are you teaching any classes at UW next academic year? Would love to take a class from you.
Yeah, it's possible. My job situation's a little ambiguous right now, but it is possible that I'm going to be teaching there. If not in the winter, then hopefully in the spring. And I will be teaching the 350 and 450, which are the wildlife, general wildlife ecology courses. Thank you for asking.
And another question as well related to post or graduate or post undergrad research around corvids. How would you recommend getting into corvid research after undergrad, whether that be grad school or other means?
Woof, this is a big question. I encourage you to email me and I can sort of give you my full spiel. The answer is focus on questions, not species. So you might be really excited about crows and ravens and spend a lot of your free time researching them and really be an expert in your own right. The problem though is if you are interested in studying these birds in a more academic sense, getting into a graduate program that allows you to do that is going to put a much stronger emphasis on your skill set rather than your knowledge set. So if you do want to pursue research in corvids, my suggestion is read contemporary papers that are coming out, kind of gauge what is the main thing people are interested in right now, and then look for opportunities that let you gain those skills. So for example, genetics is a big thing right now, using feces for genetics, being able to run assays, do all of that. You may get your start doing it in mice or some completely non-related species, but having those skills are going to make you much more appealing to a lab that actually works with these animals in the future. But please, if you want to know more, and there is a lot more to discuss, I strongly encourage you to email me. I will put my email right now in the chat, and I can send you much more helpful details than that.
Thank you. Katie, did you want to take the next question? I think with Beth.
Sure. So Beth asked she said, I have read that crows and ravens can talk. Is that true?
It is true, yeah. So, and it's not true that you have to fork their tongue to do it. That's a old myth that originates from Pliny the Elder, that some people still think is true. But no, they are excellent vocal mimics. The reason for that is, so we have a larynx. That's what allows us to talk. Birds have a slightly different organ called a syrinx. And they have independent control of either side. And what that means is that they can make different sounds at the same time. We can't do that. So that gives them incredible vocal diversity. That's also why they have so many weird and strange and wonderful calls. But so they have this incredible vocal control. So that's what allows them to really precisely mimic the sounds. And then the kind of complementary component is that, so crows and ravens are songbirds, just like a robin is. Common ravens are actually the biggest songbird in the world. And most songbirds, like a song sparrow or a goldfinch, have this really short window when they're young, when they learn new sounds, when they learn new songs. They have a tutor bird and they got to figure it out. And then that window closes and that's it. And they will never change the sounds that they make. Crows, though, like starlings or parrots or a variety of lyrebirds or a variety of other birds, are what we call lifelong learners. So they don't have that same kind of discrete window of time. And so that allows them to pick up new sounds throughout their lifetime, which means that if you hand raise a crow, or if for some reason a crow or a raven comes into your care as an adult, it can learn those sounds. And in an effort to make a connection with you, which they're very motivated to do, because these are strongly social animals, they want to forge a really close bond, they will try and adopt sounds to better communicate with you. And then of course you could just train them like you train any animal to do any kind of trick through rewards to, repeat certain sounds.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to follow that up with one more question about communication. Scott says that ravens make an amazing large number of vocalizations. Has science figured out what they are communicating when they're in those different vocalizations?
Yeah, so we've done a little better with ravens than we have with crows, but largely no. Crow communication is like the ultimate black box of research, where we put so much money and effort into this box and then nothing comes out of the other side. In fact, one of my PhD chapters looked specifically at vocalizations, because one of the things that I learned is that crows respond much more strongly to dead adults than they do to dead kids, as manifested by the size of the mob, the number of birds that come. And so we were like, well, when they see a dead adult, they must call in a way that's, communicates to the other birds, like, oh, this is a good adult, this is way scarier, and then more birds come in, right? I mean, that's how else would that work? But when we looked at the microstructures of the calls, all of the classic features, frequency, bandwidth note, duration, pause length, all of that stuff, there's like no difference between the calls that they would make for adults and juveniles. So how other birds knew to come for the adults and then they ignored it for kids, we still don't know. So it's probably that. I kind of like to think of it as a tonal language. So if you're familiar with the idea of tonal languages, it's basically that you have the same words for different things, but the inflection you use to say them means, renders them completely different in meaning to the listener. And so I suspect that crow communication is very contextual like that, where it might sound the same to us because we don't know how to fully decode it, but to the birds listening in that have so much more of that contextual information, they can parse that in a way that we can't. But far from being more simple, I have a feeling that crow communication is just more complex than we've actually been able to decode.
Super interesting. There was also a question about, is there a scientific name for a group of crows? And I just heard you say mob, but I don't know if that's a scientific name.
Yeah, so for a group of crows, I would just call it a flock, like I would if I saw a flock of ducks. A mob refers specifically to when they're angry. So when you see them all a big group of them going after a bald eagle, for example, we would refer to that as mob, and that is derived from the verb mobbing, which is what we describe anytime birds form a group in order to attack a predator. Anywhere across the literature, no matter what species of birds you were talking about, we would refer to that as mobbing.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mhm.
And then Catherine Shornick said, such a great talk. Do crows and ravens stay and or return to the same spots throughout the year? And do they stay in an established group over years?
Great question. Yeah, so crows are by and large territorial. We see some geographic differences. So for whatever reason, crows in Oklahoma are just like super chill and they don't seem as territorial, but in Seattle, they are. And so we do see really strong, the scientific term would be site fidelity. So their desire to re-nest in the similar, on their territory in similar area year after year. The one confusing thing about crows is that crows are what we call a partially migratory species, which means that a portion of the population is resident year round, but in other areas they're not. We generally see that in like interior northern Canada. It's just too cold for them to stay in the winter, so they'll come down into the States during that period of time, but then come the summer, they'll fly back to to the same territories that they occupied before, and they'll nest there. In terms of their groups, so crows are, they do mate for life. By and large, divorce, does happen, but generally speaking, when they form a pair bond, they're going to remain with that partner forever. And so they are with that bird all the time. In terms of the broader group, there's more flux there. So crows do engage in what's called cooperative breeding, which is when offspring or sometimes even non-related crows will occupy a mature pair's territory, and they'll help them raise a brood. But there is quite a lot of turnover there. So just because the son stayed on 1 year, maybe by the next year he'll disperse, maybe he'll disperse and come back. And so there is a little bit more fluctuation there.
Thank you. Katie, do you want to take the next couple of questions? I think Rolf is the next one, maybe.
Sure. So a couple of questions kind of about a little more into your research. So Rolf asks, could you discuss crow funerals?
Yeah. So crow funerals refers to this observation that human beings have had, that crows take strong notice of their dead and have this really visual and vocal response to it. So what happens when a crow discovers another deceased crow is it will alarm call, same sound it makes if it, you're letting your cat outside or sees an eagle, that kind of harsh caw. And that recruits other birds to the area, and they'll stick around for anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, scolding and flying around and perching in the trees and all of that. And so the question that I focused on for my graduate study is, well, why do they do that? Most animals don't seem to do anything if they detect another dead animal, except maybe leave. So why do crows have this really conspicuous response? And that's particularly an interesting question to ask, because when we look at the kinds of animals that have really conspicuous responses, we can sort of group them into two categories. So in the first category, you have probably the ones that are really familiar to a lot of folks, like elephants or dolphins, orcas, primates, right? So animals with that often sort of make the news for their interesting behaviors. And then in the other category, we mostly have eusocial insects. So things like bees and ants and termites. So while that may be less familiar to the public, that's actually the group we've invested more research effort in. And the reason is it's just much easier to do that. And so the trends that we see is in eusocial insects or mice or rats, we see really predictable responses every time. And that seems to be derived from the fact that these are colony living animals where, having dead bodies everywhere would be a big problem. So they have these very, instantly triggered, very specific ways that they deal with corpses. In that other group, the elephants and the primates, we see that while responses are fairly common, they're incredibly variable in how they manifest. So they could be affiliative, like, they could groom a dead body or guard it. They can be aggressive. They can, bite or beat. They can be sexual. They can be all kinds of things. And so crows are really interesting when it comes to this question, because they kind of land it, if you picture a Venn diagram where you have, the elephants and the ants, crows are kind of in the middle of that, where they have this sort of predictable response, but still with some really interesting variability. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've had people tell me stories of watching crows put sticks and other objects around dead crows. The other interesting thing about crows is that when it comes to their intelligence and their sort of social behaviors, they have a lot more in common with that vertebrate group, the mammals, like dolphins and primates, than they do with the insects. And so they're just a really nice model to ask questions about funerals. So I focus my graduate work on trying to provide an adaptive motivation behind these behaviors. Obviously, one explanation could just be that they're sad. It's an expression of grief, but that's not something that I can scientifically test, because as much as I ask them, they would never just tell me what they were thinking. So I got to figure out other ways to get at this question. And so my research was the first to show that these behaviors in crows, at least, are motivated by anti-predator strategies. It's a way that they learn about danger. And we tested that in a variety of ways, but that was kind of the main thing, which is, again, there can be multiple layers to things, like ogres. Crows are onions, they have layers. So there might be other reasons for, like grief, for why they, have this really strong response, but I can definitely say that part of that list of reasons is that they view dead crows as cues of danger, and they use them to learn about their environment. So that was maybe a much longer answer than you were looking for, or if there's anything else, feel free to clarify, but that's kind of like the broad overview of the crow funeral situation.
Cool. I feel like that also answered Ellen's question about the focus of your Corvid research a little bit, but kind of want to follow up a little bit. Jessica says, I've read that sometimes when crows are used in scientific research, they can thwart the experiments because they're so clever. Have you seen this?
Yeah, yes. I mean, so the best example, most recent example of birds thwarting, because you use that word, is Australian magpies, which are not corvids. I know, misnomer. They're kind of butcher bird. But there was a story that came out a few weeks ago about how people were putting telemetry devices on them, which is a way that we track movement. And the birds were helping each other by pulling the units off. It was like, oh my gosh, I'm actually about to deploy telemetry units on the Monarch. So I'm just like praying that they don't do that, because the amount of time and money and effort that it goes into putting something like that on a bird is enormous. It's incredibly precarious, like it's not something that you can do on a whim. And so I'm sure the researchers were just like, oh my God, but that's not technically a corvid. Certainly though, in my experiments, and I had a colleague who was doing cognition stuff where he was trying to train crows to, do the New Caledonian crow task, where the Aesop's fable water and pitcher task, where they had this cylinder and it was full of water and there was food floating on top, and they had to drop rocks in it to try and raise the water level so that they could get the food. I mean, the way that they mostly outsmart us is just by not doing by being like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to participate. And you're like, okay, please though. I want to go home. And yeah, I didn't have, although, oh no, here, I do have one really good story. I was doing work in Bothell. I was doing my crow funeral stuff. And for this particular study, I was trying to verify if, maybe the way crows respond to dead crows is just how they respond to any dead animal, or is it unique to crows? That was the question I wanted to ask. So I would put out these stuffed pigeon skins, like a taxidermy dead pigeon, And I wanted to gather data so I could show like how they respond to that and how they respond to a crow is different. It's clearly not the same thing. And I did have one crow like come down, like looked at the pigeon, and they're stuffed, right? So they're really light. And it just picks it up and flies it to somebody's house and puts it on the roof. And I'm like, oh God, I have to like go to this person and I had to knock on their door and be like, so I'm doing work on crows and you have this pigeon on your roof and it's my only one and I really need it back. And that's kind of on me. I should have anticipated that. So from then on, I had to tie lead weights to all my taxidermied birds' ankles so the crows didn't make off with them. So yes, they can certainly, whether it's their cleverness or their anything else, they are very good at causing problems.
Those are great stories. Thank you. There's lots of questions here. Did you put some together, Katie, that you want to ask together, or should we just go in order, or?
I say let's just keep going because we got quite a few.
Okay. So I see one from Kyler. Are there any stories or myths related to gift giving crows?
That's a great question. I don't know about, so that's context for everyone else. So people who feed crows regularly often report getting what they describe as gifts. And these things could be found objects, or it could be bird feathers or bones or any number of other things. The most well-known example of this was a little girl that lived in the Montlake neighborhood in Seattle, Gabby Mann. And there was an article that came out, I think it was in the BBC or the Guardian or something, many years ago at this point. And she had gotten hundreds of gifts from a rather large flock of crows that her family had been feeding. And she had this adorable little tackle box with each thing labeled and all the different things. And after that article came out, a lot of people were like, oh, this has happened to me too. And our lab got a lot of emails from folks sort of validating and sharing their own experience of this. So what I can offer from a scientific perspective is that certainly crows leaving things behind in places that they're regularly fed is a thing. Whether or not it is done in a gesture of gratitude, I can't speak to. I don't know why crows do it. It's certainly true that there are a lot of very dedicated crow feeders who've never gotten gifts. So it would in some ways be kind of a shame if it was done in gratitude, because that would mean there's a lot of people whose crows are kind of assholes. They don't seem to care that they go to the effort to feed them every day. So it's kind of like the grieving during the funerals. I can't say that that's what's happening, but I also can't say it's not. Some of the other explanations could be that they are curious and they pick things up and they're flying around and then they're like, oh, my chicken leg is there for the day. And, they go and they'd much rather carry the chicken leg around. So they leave their other little thing behind. Alternatively, it could also be a behavior that we've sort of trained into them with rewards, right? So it happens by accident the first time. The person's so excited that they put out more food or higher quality food. And then the crows are like, do you want garbage? Because I can give you more garbage if you'll keep giving me food. This is no problem. And so, it might be kind of reinforced that way. Lots of explanations. But no, I don't know of any specific examples of that in, traditional storytelling. But if anyone knows that, I'll put that in my next talk. So share it with me.
That is so great. Thank you for those stories. Kelly is sharing a link from a study at UW Bothell about crow communication. I don't know if that ties into your work as well, but thank you for sharing that, Kelly. And then Kelly has a question as well. I lived in Bothell in quite some time and watched the crows arrive, thousands of them every night. Can you share why they are such a social creature and how they socially interact in such large groups?
So what Kelly is describing is crows, even though they're territorial, so during the day, they kind of go to their individual little areas and they'll defend those areas from other birds, from other crows. At night, in the non-breeding season, they engage in what's called communal roosting. A lot of other birds do this. Starlings do it, robins do it. where they sleep in a big group at night. And crows are indeed incredibly social birds. So this kind of makes sense that they would make the transition into that behavior. And it's basically, it's an anti-predator behavior. So safety in numbers when they sleep. It's also, yes, probably an important social opportunity. Crows exhibit what we call a fission-fusion social system, the way that dolphins and human beings do, where we have social groups, but we might leave those groups and not see individuals for a while and then come back together. And in fact, fission-fusion social systems are one of the things that have really pushed us and other animals cognitively, because that's an incredibly difficult sort of mental thing to track all of those different relationships. And so roost might be an important opportunity for crows to reconnect. It might be a way that unmated crows find new partners. There's a lot, roosting is kind of like communication in that it's a really visible thing that you would think we would know so much about, but there's so much we haven't explored. But as for, why crows are social creatures, that's kind of $1 million question. But because there's a strong advantage, just like there is for human beings. There's a very strong advantage to being social. They can learn by each other's example. They can avoid predators. So that's probably like the big picture why, but the smaller picture of that, that's like a whole nother PhD. And even then you're only asking like 1/8 of a question.
Thank you. There are lots of thank yous to you, Kaeli. So lots of them in the chat. And then I see a question from Susan. Do Seattle crows still get riled up by Richard Nixon?
I love this question because it's always fun to see who people remember. And I get, and this Susan, I get Richard Nixon a lot. So you're not the only person to think that, but it's the person you are thinking of is Dick Cheney. And in this, so it really disappoints people, but in the original study, he was actually the neutral face and not the dangerous one, which I wasn't part of that. I won't speak to the political implications of that. Don't read into it, but that was true. But the answer is yes. Actually, in the context, in the spirit of your question, which is crows over 10 years ago were exposed to a particular face in a negative way. Do they still to this day remember that face? The answer is yes. And they are testing that every year at the UW still. So I can speak to that on some authority.
Katie, I think Nicole's question is next, if you want to take that one.
Sure. So this one's kind of a specific behavior question. We have occasionally seen the male crow acting as sentinel through the night instead of going to the communal roost during nesting season, but not consistently. Is there a specific period of time where this is common, or do they only do this if they feel it's a higher risk situation?
No, that's a great question, Nicole, and I don't know the answer. Certainly crow pairs don't go to the roost. When crows have eggs and small nestlings, they need to keep them warm. And so they incubate or brood them. While male crows can sit temporarily on an egg, they don't develop what's called a brood patch. They don't lose the feathers on their belly that allow them to actually regulate temperature. So only females are charged with that, particularly at night. And so during that time, a female can't go to the roost because if she were to abandon her eggs overnight, they would fail, most likely. And so, so the male is just kind of hanging out. As far as, my understanding is that he's by and large on the territory for that time because she would be so, vulnerable. And so it's in his best genetic interest to make sure no harm befalls her or his offspring. So he would be motivated to stay on the territory overnight. But there is some gray area where certainly they do leave a little bit. And as the kids get older, like right after they first fledge, and I actually don't know exactly the breakdown of that. So I'll try and look into that, Nicole, because that's a great question. And I bet somebody does know the answer.
So I've got one more question. You shared so many wonderful stories from so many different cultures and throughout history and time. Do you have one that's your absolute favorite, kind of myth or story about corvids that you like to share?
I mean, I do like the story of the fire crow quite a lot, because it paints crows in such a positive light. And it's just when people are like, oh, crows are gross and evil, and I'm like, well, let me tell you a story. And that's just such a good one to illustrate that people have had very different perspectives on crows. So I think that's probably my favorite one.
Scott is wondering if the older crows are passing down the Cheney mask lessons to newer generations. And if so, how do you speculate that they do that?
Great question, Scott. They are. So we've been able to track that through this study by banding the offspring of crows of the original participants. And we see that the offspring also scold these faces, even though they've had no direct experiences with them. We don't think that they do this via like offhand communication, meaning I don't think that they like sit around at the nest and they're like, all right, there's this guy. He's bald and he has a big nose and he's bad. I think it's really by demonstration. So they're going out in the world, they're on their territory. This person comes through the territory, they see the adults scolding and they're like, okay, it doesn't really matter to me why you don't like this person. I see that, you're teaching me that they're a predator. It is still an open question though, like, because when they would do these studies, and even now, if you've been to the UW campus or any state school campus, you can imagine just a throng of people walking, right? So if you have one person walking through a crowd, how is it that the birds that are learning the correct person? We don't know the answer to that. I think it has to do with body language. So they'll often come and like dive bomb the person. So I suspect that that's how they're indicating like, it's this guy. But we don't actually know specifically the answer to
that. And do crows in urban settings have any predators?
Absolutely. So barred owls and great horned owls would be really common predators in Seattle. Cooper's hawks, particularly Cooper's hawks, will go after nestlings. Cats, raccoons will all go after nestlings. So in terms of adults, it's going to be the big raptors. If you've ever seen crows go after the eagles, I get a lot of questions like, why do they harass the eagles so much? The eagles are so beautiful. Why are they doing that? It's because eagles kill them and they're babies. And you'll see every once in a while, if you watch enough of these interactions, you will eventually see a time when they're going after, the eagle and doing their dives, and an eagle or red-tailed hawk will flip over and grab one out of the sky and kill it. So it's dangerous to try and evict predators, but they do it for a reason.
Wow. Thank you so much. This has just been absolutely fascinating and just engrossing. We can't thank you enough. Katie, was there anything you wanted to say to wrap up? Because we're just about at the 8 o'clock hour.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and an extra special thank you to Dr. Swift for coming to share all this knowledge with us and speak with us. It was fascinating. And I just want to make a plug for folks to tune into our next speaker next month. On May 19th, we have Rena Priest, the Poet Laureate, a Lummi native, to join us. And so you guys should all tune in for that as well.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We really
appreciate it. Yeah, thank you for inviting me and for showing up. And if anyone wants to have any questions or has any questions they want to ask that they didn't get a chance to hear, feel free to find me on social media at Corvid Research, which I'll pop in the comment. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and my blog is corvidresearch.blog. I have a lot of articles about crows, so I look forward to seeing some of you.
That is so awesome. Lots of thank yous flooding into the chat window in appreciation for your talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.